I'm a research fellow at QRIFS, which is Kazakh Research Institute for Future Studies, and also a PhD candidate at IIST Shibpur. We'll be presenting together, me and John. John is the director of QRIFS, and we'll be presenting together on the future culture and urban planning with some insights from our research across a few post-Soviet Central Asian cities on the ancient Silk Road. So, what is the relationship between culture and urban planning? Culture is something with which we live, with which we have grown. It's very much specific to a group or category or a community, and it has been a learned aspect. It has been passed down to us by our ancestors, or we have occupied a few or borrowed some and even let out something which we never wanted. And in urban planning, which is for human settlements, we consider the 5 elements which had been described by C.A. Doxicadis are nature, man, society, buildings, and networks. And culture has never been a calculative indicator in urban planning, which it has to be because it is a very important aspect, as we'll see further. The factors that we have been considering till now for planning have been climate and vegetation, ethnicity, the religion, community, historical aspects of the area, accessibility of the area, the linkages, and the topography. Then Silk Road era. I'll be talking in 3 different time eras: the Silk Road era, the Soviet era, and then the post-Soviet era. Silk Road, as we know, had been a very ancient trade route connecting several countries, starting all the way from China, all the way to Europe. And but then it was not only limited to the exchange of merchandise. Along with that, it led to the exchange of religion, politics, and culture, which gave way to the exchange of literature, language, and food, etc. And I'll take you through my personal experience. When I saw Buddhist architecture in Kazakhstan, I realized how Buddhism traveled all the way from Bodh Gaya, my native place in India, throughout the world through Silk Road. Bodh Gaya was the place where Lord Buddha got his enlightenment. My next example would be this very interesting. People see Taj Mahal as the symbol for India. And Taj Mahal was built by one of the Mughal emperor, and Mughal Empire started in India through Babur, who traveled from a province called Osh, which is another important city on the ancient Silk Road and has been very historic. It's in the neighboring country called Kyrgyzstan. And he traveled all the way from Osh to India via Silk Road. And the shocking realization that I had was regarding food. I always thought samosa was an Indian food, but then after coming to Kazakhstan, I realized samosa had been a modified version of the Kazakh samsa. So John, do you have any such similar experiences?
Yeah, so for me, one of the things I love about being in Almaty is that it's such a great food city. And I think that whether it's the somsa or even naan bread that you see in the region, you really get to live and breathe in a space where these cultural and certainly food, I think, is the most tangible aspect of that. That it's you get to see the sharing and the exchange that's there. And I think food is one of the best examples of this, right? So I think all across Almaty, there's an extraordinary range of different foods that are available. And it's one aspect, I think, that if we imagine, cities and planning, and we think about it in relation to food, and one of the great things that Aditee will talk more about in Almaty is the bazaar, I think it starts to shift the kind of thinking we have about the kinds of futures that we might to imagine.
Yeah. And I'm sure there must be infinite more examples of such cultural exchanges through Silk Road over here or probably across this road. And, right now when the lockdown started, I got bored and I started reading this book It's Silk Road Journey by Zhuangzhang, with Zhuangzhang. It tells about how a person traveled through Silk Road, and for he I don't know, I haven't completed the book, but then it's about Buddhism and his experience along the several provinces or the cities that he traveled to. So, the ancient Silk Road, it reminds us of the connection between the cities and the culture. And over here, I would want to ask a question: how are cities and culture influencing one another? For me, for my personally, I would want to say that it is the flourishing nature of the cities with religion. The cities act as hubs for religion, culture, politics, trade, and then it influences the region, if not the globe. And the city planners need to consider that these aspects are really important and it needs to be taken in mind or considered while planning. But unfortunately, it has never been. So I'll take you all through my research site. One of the research sites that I need to work on, and this is the beautiful city of Almaty. Almaty is one of the ancient cities on the Silk Road, and other than being an ancient city, and just in the past 2 centuries, it saw multiple regimes. In the pre-Soviet era, we can consider the Tsars. They ruled the place, and then came the Soviet era, and now the post-Soviet era. But the story doesn't end here. Almaty was the capital city for the Republic of Kazakhstan when it was a part of the Soviet Union. And when the Union broke, again, it was the capital city for a few years, till 1997, I remember. And after that, the capital was moved to Astana, now Nur Sultan. But then still, till today, Almaty continues to remain the largest city in the country and arguably the most important business and cultural hub. So now coming to the very well archived city planning aspect, this Almaty during Soviet era was under construction. The era saw industrial transformations. The government, for city planning, the government took up initiatives for multiple cooperative housings and built. They tried to diversify the architectural features to enhance the city's scale. Along with that, they also tried to build multiple schools, colleges, hospitals, and other cultural and entertainment centers, which was following the Soviet model strictly. But after that, in the post-Soviet era, in 1998, a city development plan was made for Almaty city, targeting the year 2030, and it was named as the Almaty General Plan. One of the major objectives of this city was to give the city an image of the city of flowers, which it actually lives up to. It's all colorful flowers here, tulips, roses, whatnot. And then it continued. The plan had the objective to continue the multiple storied and single housing developments. It talked about improvising the industrial area, modifying the transport infrastructure, and also expanding the metro line. But then, of the many problems that the city has, one of them is air pollution, and another one can be traffic, unmanageable traffic. John, would you want to explain your experience with traffic?
Well, I think like most people in Almaty, it's basically trying to get anywhere at a certain range of times is absolutely impossible. And for a city that's quite small, where the density is not very high, you can see very clearly that there's such a reliance, and these are obviously interconnected, right? So air pollution is of course relative to not just people using like wood burning, coal burning stoves during winter, but of course like during traffic and congestion. So I think from my perspective, it forces you to think about the patterns of life, and it clearly has an impact on culture as well. And I think that that's something, whether you're talking about Delhi, whether you're talking about New York or Almaty, the kinds of ways in which we make choices about design, or in which things kind of emerge through the natural sort of complexity of human existence, I think really reflects these kinds of issues, and has deep-rooted sort of cultural context that we have to make sense of. So I think it forces me to think about the rhythms and patterns of my own life, and kind of the ways in which I'm a part of the culture, and try to like move just by the nature of living in the city.
All these things it imply is that beyond population, while city planning, not a lot of future scenarios were considered. That says that in this fast moving and complex world, where one virus could shake the world's population and its economy, there needed to be an integration of future studies and city planning, which now we find is significant. We need to integrate it. And like, purely talking from my personal experience for the past 1 month of lockdown in this city has a culture of bazaars, which I again thought bazaar was a Indian term, but then this city has several bazaars, and few of them being formal or covered, which is like Green Bazaar is a very good example of that. And it has become a lot touristy now. And other than that, we have street vendors, which is, the street vendors are mostly elderly women selling perishable goods on the pavements. So to keep the economy and supply running during this lockdown, the bazaars have been running, including the street vendors. And now here comes the catch. The government can deal with the sanitization, safety, and other measures regarding the virus in the covered bazaar or in the formal bazaars. But what about those hundreds and hundreds of people selling on the streets? They are a very big part of the informal economy, not only for the city, but also for the country. And had the planners been a bit sensitive of the ground reality, the bazaar culture, and informal economy, this outbreak could have been controlled further and quicker in a city like Almaty. Urban planning has been a dynamic process, and it has always been about futures. But the decisions that have been made have always been top down. If the locals would have been given a chance to be a stakeholder, or their opinion would have been considered, the participatory approach would have given way to a more localized planning, and the people would have wanted to keep their culture going, not mechanically following any city's development model, putting it in another city, which cannot work. It has to be calibrated. And as a scholar of future studies and an urban planner, I can say that for a better future, we need to assess the probable, then imagine the possible, and then finally decide on the preferable, but keeping culture in mind. John?
Yeah, I think just to build on what Aditee said, there's a rich history and many examples of collaboration between future studies and planning. And I was looking back at some of these examples, maybe we can click again, that it's fascinating to think about how is it that culture is and is not part of this. Actually, maybe I'll share my screen. That way I can have the presentation, yeah? Okay, great. For a really recent interesting thing was done, this was done by a colleague, Stuart Candy. He worked with mayors, and of course there are groups like Institute for the Future that have the sort of the GovLab and a variety of things. And it's really fascinating, what do cities start to look like if mayors do begin to think as futurists? And so again, there is that rich history and lots of interesting work certainly still being done. But I think as Aditee points out, what about culture? And culture is also, I think, like futures. It's not a singular thing, right? We should talk about cultures even within a particular cultural context. There are a variety of experiences and hybrid, identities and different practices. So culture, I think, is just as much of a plurality and an amorphous thing as we talk about futures plural. So thinking about the relations here, I was starting to relate this back to some of the work that we've been doing. So over the past year, our institute is quite new, or we're just a bit over a year old. We were trying to make sense of some of the ways that people identify culture in relation to into Almaty in Kazakhstan. And one of the things that's sort of a hallmark kind of the city is the is Medeo, which apparently is the, I'll try to get this right. It's the highest altitude sort of ice skating rink in the world, and it's quite famous. It's quite beautiful. It's right at the foothills of the mountains, and it's really a cultural icon. And so what we wanted to do is to use aspects of culture and planning as provocations for thinking, as Aditee had mentioned, imagining different possibilities for the future. So last year we rolled out, this was really one of our first projects focused on Almaty's futures. We had 4 different postcards. We used the Manoa School modeling method to essentially create these 4 futures. And we tried to imagine these different possibilities. And of course, we looked broadly and not just thinking about urban landscape, which is really clear in some of these, but also thinking about issues in relation to climate change. So for example, you see the ice skating rink at the top right, because of climate change, is now a swimming pool. Again, a bit sort of ridiculous, maybe a bit even fantastical, but precisely meant to challenge our thinking around, you know, what is the possibility space that we need to engage with at a city level. And I'll provide a link so you can download these. I think the most important actually comes in the bottom left, which is the blank postcard. And as Aditee had mentioned, how do we get better at having more participatory, more collaborative means by which we could imagine the future together, and then finding ways to implement and enact that. Because certainly if we're doing these activities and giving people hope, but not actually providing the means to either formally or informally put them into practice, and again, formally and hopefully means that we have government support for that. And I will say that Almaty is making great strides, I think, in that regard. Then we're just wasting a lot of time. So I think that it is about getting people to critically and creatively imagine. And I think Aditee's work is great because it's really challenging us to think about where we want to move cities to. As we were talking about this presentation, we also realized that we wanted to locate it in what's happening now. Of course, we are all, many of us, confronting the current crisis in cities and seeing how cities are responding. And we're even seeing now that whether it's, you know, in federal systems like India or the US, where states have a lot of power, but in also places like, you know, like London or other sort of mega cities, that cities are at the forefront of policy in many ways. You know, cities are kind of taking the role that we might expect national governments to have. And cities are finding ways of confronting the crisis and having to respond that is sometimes, again, you know, better, sometimes even more challenging, or creating new kinds of challenges. And I thought this was really interesting, and there's been some great thinking around this. You know, the current crisis is one around urbanization. It's impossible to de-link those things. So thinking about density management, thinking about how we organize cities, I think is something that hopefully comes out of this, and hopefully futures can be a bigger part of that. And then I think also really importantly that you know, if we want cities to be the kinds of places where there is equity, where there is sustainability, then of course we need, you know, we need open, we need transparent, we need collaborative ways of organizing those cities, and of people feeling like they can participate in those processes in ways that are meaningful. And so I think for us, it was, as we were talking and thinking about this, it was really kind of ending with this question, you know, how is the current crisis, how is the pandemic going to affect, you know, cities, cultures, and the relation between the two? And how do we find better ways as futurists and as researchers and as thinkers and as really, you know, participants in cities to imagine what we want those cities to be like, and how those cities could be, and how we can start to shape them into a better way. So thank you again. Great to participate, and I really appreciate to present with Aditee.
Well, it's for you, John.
Well, I think we can both answer. So yeah, there's been tons of work on smart cities, thinking about the best means to get people on board to design the city together, community action, city council, cross-border collaboration, examples. So on the one hand, I think there's great work that's been done in the smart city space. A good friend and colleague, Jonathan Reichenthal, he was the former CTO of Palo Alto. They pioneered lots of tech and thinking about sort of like tech for good and how that could aid, and whether that was trying to find you know, better, more streamlined ways of you know, moving data around the city, collecting data in relation to things like, you know, traffic or other means, I think has been quite effective. So I think Jonathan Reichental's work has been quite good. Of course, on the other side, we've seen lots of criticisms, right, around sort of what, Google's been doing in Toronto, concerns over privacy, over data, sort of the ethics of surveillance, and how we begin to find ways of engaging. I think also there's been some great more grassroots work that's been done also in Mexico City. And I wanted to mention in Almaty that there's a really cool project that was put together last year by a woman named Adele called Future City Manifesto. And she got a grant as part of an international project to do community level visioning. And so, here I show up to kind of launch this Futures Institute, and everyone I meet is like, oh, hey, you should talk to Anel. And I go, and there she's doing futures work and this really fantastic stuff. And of course, I didn't have any expectation that our institute was going to bring futures there. But it already existed in a way that I thought was really powerful and that I was learning from and was really, trying to participate in and to support. So I think actually that's really, really important to understand, like the kinds of work that's often done. And I think within smart cities, this is a conversation that we have to try to find a way to be a little more clear about sort of the ethics. Are we looking fundamentally to, give power to certain forces? And clearly now we're dealing with this because I think we've all seen Google and Apple are now rolling out this, Bluetooth technology. It's anonymized, right? But there are obviously concerns and questions. And I think as we go forward, it is around participation, but we're also dealing with questions of, health and public safety. So, how do we deal with that? The one thing we didn't mention, and I'll just mention it briefly, and then stop talking. We talked about the ancient Silk Road, but of course, China has the One Belt, One Road initiative. They've invested a lot in infrastructure and clearly looking to utilize that for, a strategic advantage and certainly economic growth. So I think that, these kinds of questions is quite critical as we go forward. And I think this crisis will hopefully help us think about that.
We have
jump in? Yeah.
Which I find really interesting. How can we manage culture and identity in a diverse culture megacities? If most of its population are not born there, and how can we create links with them? Even if the culture never needs to be born at a place, it can be borrowed. It has always been developing over the years and changing over the years. So it's just a way of life that we try to live, and then it continues like that. So even today, we might not have been carrying forward all the things that have been given to us, but then we have modified it according to us. And then there are aspects with which we would want to measure that. And okay, this is another question. For smart cities, why not create a brand new cities? It might be cheaper and no legacy problems, but we do not have land for that. We already have plenty of cities existing, and we would not want to cut down forests further because climate change is real. Is political will and political imagination of our main barrier to get good ideas applied, supported. Example, the idea from 30 years of WHO working on healthy cities and urban health. John, would you want to take this?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I think it's precisely the intersection of will and imagination that we, as I think people who study and work on and help people think about the future can have real value there. And again, just to be clear, it's not that people don't think about the future. It's that oftentimes the kind of the vulnerabilities that are unfortunately all too normalized create conditions where we don't actually find, or we can't realize pathways for alterity or for doing things different. So I think that there's no shortage of extraordinarily examples. I mean, I think actually that's the problem, is like we spend a lot of time focusing on diagnosis, but we know what the issues are, right? I mean, we clearly know that we need to do a lot of things better, and a lot of that focuses on socioeconomic ordering. How do we find better ways of moving away from this, extractive surveillance-based capitalism? How do we find better ways of creating the kinds of conditions of possibility whereby we could allow for, human flourishing? And I think fundamentally that the challenge that we are absolutely seeing now, if there's one thing that I think is valuable about our current moment, is that the veils have dropped. We can see the leaders that are interested in humanity as a whole, and in, you know, taking care of us, and we can see the leaders that aren't. And so it's incumbent then, I think, upon us to, you know, find ways of mobilizing. And in some places that works through existing systems. In some places that means we need entirely new systems. So I think for me, the question around will and imagination is absolutely critical. I mean, there's no doubt that that is a fundamental barrier. And I think it's it's up to us to see how we could continue to stage provocations, thinking about the push and pulls of the future, and to try to find better ways of getting there. And I think fundamentally that's where a lot of the interesting futures work is happening. I know in my own training, and something that is a conversation a lot of us are looking to continue, how do we actually help to facilitate people learning and thinking about governance design? And by governance design, I don't mean that, you know, when we talk about sort of the idea of I'm going to learn about government, but how would you begin to think about designing governance? For a number of years at the University of Hawaii, it was the only place in the world you could take a course in governance design. And so I think this question around kind of barriers to the problems that we're seeing relate back a lot to the kind of formal and informal educational systems that we have. You know, why is it that we're not teaching more people to think about the future? Why is it that we're not teaching things like governance design? Why is it that we're not putting culture at the forefront of planning? And I think that these things will necessarily have to shift as we begin to realize that there's just no sustainability in how we've been doing things. Other question?
Cross question.
Yeah, there's so many good questions. There's a really good question here. Is there evidence that governance feels an urgency to be more future forward? If mayors could be futurists, what are the kind of good results? Convince governments to be employees be futurists, upskill. Yeah, I mean, just to jump in quickly on this question, which I think is really great. Certainly, you know, I try to keep pulse on what I think is happening globally by talking to people. And, you know, as a futurist, I've never been busier. And I think a lot of colleagues also working in the space realize that people are precisely wanting this kind of level of analysis. But I want to circle back to something that I think came up in the previous session with Riel, Pupul, and Geshi, which is around the kinds of things that we're feeding into. And I think that a lot of futures work kind of gets subsumed under foresight, right? Which is directly tying into a policy strategy or planning process. And there's no doubt, as someone who works on those processes, that I want them to be better. I want them to be more forward looking. But on the other hand, there's the kind of soft skill mindset side, right? Which is how we find ways of shifting and creating the context and the conditions whereby people start to move towards, and this is a lot of, I think, UNESCO's work, of being more futures literate. And so having futures literacy as a capability, as a capacity of our humanity. And I think that's where it's kind of the two sides of the game. On the one hand, of course, we want to speak truth to power and work within existing systems. And I do think now governments are fundamentally going to be more open to this in a way that they weren't before. The challenge that we have, to go back to the other side, is not to simply allow it to play back into the existing game, and to find ways, and I think a lot of people have talked about this, of dismantling things that clearly are destructive, and trying to find ways to create, you know, the alternative possibilities. I think if we look back at, you know, futurists that kind of blended this, certainly the wise words of Buckminster Fuller, you know, who talked a lot about, we often don't change things within the existing model. We have to create a new model that makes the old model obsolete. And so my hope is that the kinds of experiments that we will necessarily see, and they might feel and see like experiments, or certainly that we're being experimented on, are done in ways that are humane, that are ethical, that are co-constitutive. And this is where I think post-normal times, post-normal science approaches that governments are starting very clearly to pay attention to in ways they weren't previously, hopefully come to the fore.
So, what would you say to somebody who says that cultural layer is not a priority right now? Culture doesn't need to be a priority. It has to be a part of the city. It has to go along as the city. And right now for the COVID, we know that we know we are struggling with the health infrastructure very badly. We are struggling with the management, with the governance. We are struggling with the lockdown, which is affecting the economy a lot. And at this moment, definitely, we would want to keep the country running. But then culture is not a priority over here. It's not a different layer. It has always been an inbuilt part of a place. And there is, entrepreneurs have lost a lot of business, little boutique street food restaurant. That's what to do. That's precisely that we were talking of. This one virus could shake the world's population and its economy. We need to realize that we had not done the planning properly, or maybe we were not prepared. For example, in Japan, there were several futurists who said the country needs to be prepared for the tsunami, for the earthquakes, but then they were not considered. And before the construction for the preparedness could be completed, the country was stuck. They lost a lot of lives, they lost a lot of infrastructure. So every time, planning is what we do for the future. We have to be prepared for what we has to come. And then, are some cultures more aligned with future thinking than others because of historical continuity of culture? It's, culture is something that grows. It's something with which we live. That's what I've been repeating over and over again. See the city of it. For example, Italy. A major part of the city culture is the street side cafes. People love to spend a lot of time in those cafes. Similarly, for US, people love to spend times in pubs or bars, and that has been a very much part of the city. But then, this how sometimes we need to control what we are doing, especially in this COVID, the social distancing, as it's being called, which I would want to say that for me it's more of physical distancing than social distancing. We need to be connected to people, and social media is what we call a virtual life we have right now. We are not distancing ourselves from people around us through those medias or through those, but then we are actually distancing ourselves from different peoples physically. So there has to be an interlinking of what we are doing and what we want to do, and this has to come from what has been happening till now.
Can I jump in on this question too? Because it's really fascinating to think about sort of the cultural context of futures. A colleague did a really interesting analysis a few years ago, Ilhan Bai, who now teaches in South Korea. He found that some cultures actually didn't or couldn't have the word for futures plural. And even in English, right, it's a bit of a weird thing. You talk about futures, it's become more common now. And actually, I thought that was really fascinating because it pointed to this kind of, language culture, kind of like not duality, but connectivity. And I think that you find across cultures, whether they have a specific word for foresight or whether they have a specific word for futures plural, that there is often traditions of thinking about the future, and sometimes those are tied to divination. So it's tied to prediction, things that obviously professional futurists don't talk about. We're not rolling bones, we're not looking into crystal balls, at least not all the time. But like fundamentally, like I think that you do see this across cultures in different ways. Of course now, and what I like about this question is it's poking us to think about kind of the aspects of culture that might facilitate futures thinking, the aspects of different cultures that could be really utilized here. And so I think it actually is really important to dive into this. And I've been, reflecting on my own sort of like training, my own sort of like traditions. So my intellectual training is history, philosophy, religion. I come more humanities, social science aspect to it. But there are others that come from more engineering, more science, more technology. I think it's really interesting to think about the ways and the degrees to which futures thinking is always already facilitated through a cultural context and a cultural lens, and the ways that different cultures obviously utilize it. I mean, if we look now, futures is flourishing globally. So whether we're talking about the Americas, whether we're talking about East Asia, you find it in different contexts, and it always has that uniqueness. And I think that's what's really interesting is that cultural lens is always brought to it. So there are really, I think, great examples, and certainly the rich history of organizations like the World Future Studies Federation, which really at the height of the Cold War was all about breaking, down barriers and borders to gather people together and to have conversations about possibilities for the future. I think, culture and the aspects of culture that have been critical to futures are now really coming to the fore. And I think Aditee's work is also pushing us to think about the intersection of design there too. More questions?
We have a comment. Also, culture is such a strong leverage in what will be done next. Example, in Algeria, it was hard to close the mosque at first, and then it was accepted. And then there is this sense of fatalism, saying if something is meant to happen, it will happen no matter what we'll do about it. No, we can always control it, especially in this case of this virus.
It reminds me of one of my favorite sayings that I learned from Zia Sadar and Sohail and Ayatollah, which is actually an Arab proverb. Actually, it comes from the Quran. It's a hadith. The Prophet Muhammad was asked about by someone if he should tie his camel or not worry about it. And the Prophet's response apparently was trust in Allah and tie your camel. Sometimes it's tie your camel and trust in Allah. But I think that that's where it kind of brings these two together, the faith part, the culture part, the religion part, the very human aspect of how we make sense and understand the world, which is obviously critical to our lens to the future. And then what futures and foresight is supposed to be, which is what Aditee is, I think, challenging us to think about. It's the tying our camel part, right? So this question around, or the point around sort of like the closing down of the mosques and the masjids, clearly people have also struggled with this in the US. There was that crazy video, or it seemed crazy to me, of a person who had left a big church service, and when they were asked about sort of, did you worry? They were like, no, Jesus will protect you. And so I think that, again, if we take those kinds of responses seriously, we have to find better strategies and ways with which we can connect with people and what's important to them. And that's why the culture, future, design, urban planning aspect is really critical together to speak about or to speak in ways that connect with people so they understand, and to think about the kinds of shifts, because clearly we have to have a sense of connectedness. There has to be some kind of social contract, and not in the classic sort of enlightenment sense, but an awareness that we live as communities, and so we have to participate in decisions as communities, but realize also there's a greater good that we want to participate and give to each other. So I think that's where we have to have better conversations, and I really like that point around sort of like, how do we leverage culture, and how do we think about culture as a form of leverage towards the future? There was a question back up here about islands, which I thought was really interesting. Okay, so if I could jump in on this one, there's an island country with various and diverse cultures. How do we find a common element when planning at a national level? So I lived on an island for 9 years. I was a guest in Hawaii, where I did my master's and my PhD studies. And since 2014, I left the US. So I've been a guest all over the world, and I've had long stretches in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. My wife is from Belarus, and I now live in Kazakhstan. So I think for me, like, one of the things that I appreciate, and there's also a question just above it about being an expat, and I'm sort of a perennial expat now, it seems. Although I want a different word. I don't want to be X something. I want to be im something else, but I'm not sure what that word is. So I think actually that the question points out that the greatest common element, the common element is diversity. I think that, when we look at kind of a lot of national enterprises that are done, a lot of national kind of myth making, that often it tries to recount a history that can be very selective. But I think actually there are some great projects, and certainly, when I think about what this looks like in relation to diversity, Singapore has had a lot of challenges, of course, but Singapore, I think, has done a lot to play to the strengths of its diversity. It's Chinese, it's Malay, it's Indian community, it's other communities that have come in and been really critical to its development and its identity. And so the people that I know from Singapore, often gesture towards and speak about their diversity as a strength, and you feel it in really tangible ways. And so again, whether it's a specific island community or other communities that are quite diverse, and as someone who participates in very diverse communities, oftentimes where I don't fully have a comprehension of the language or I'm able to communicate fully, I'm appreciative of that diversity. And I think to speak to that, the question just above it around sort of being an expat, I think that when we see the kinds of places that have taken really big hits, they are global cities. And clearly, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, New York or even Wuhan, which had a significant sort of expat population, or even Almaty, which actually I feel is a global city. It's about finding ways of allowing that diversity to be an asset, even in times of crisis. So of course, lots of people are concerned, I need to get home, I need to get out, but lots of people also have families and a sense of connectedness there. So how do we get better at making sure that there are spaces where people can work together in those cities? And I think that there is that often, you know, unfortunate aspects of being treated as a foreigner. But I've again felt really fortunate and felt welcomed in Almaty, and so I think there are some good examples of places where cities do feel open for people, and that there's a lot of usefulness in that. And again, the lessons of the Silk Road are that we benefit as a whole, as humanity, from those kinds of sharing and those kinds of processes. So how do we get better at doing that and at fighting against, I think, some of those nationalist tendencies that are clearly used for political reasons that are trying to implement certain kinds of projects. Yeah.
I think we have one last question. Does the sense of who influences our future, example Jesus, also influence on sense of agency?
What do you think?
Related to God and then sense of agency?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, at least from my perspective, you know, one of the things, oh, so I can hear someone. No? Okay. So maybe that was feedback, or maybe it was Jesus, who knows? But I think for me, what's really interesting is this question of who or what or whom kind of shapes the future. I think is quite critical, and there's no doubt that whether we're talking about the factors of culture, or whether we're talking about sort of the myth making of nationalist kind of ethos, that there are a variety of things that shift the kind of agency. And I think I want to use that in the dual sense of the actual agency that we have and the perceptual agency that we have, and obviously bring those two together. I think it's really important to see and understand that we do have agency to shape the future. And that is the decisions that we make every day. And that's, of course, in the variety of forms of political imagination, political will, political activity that we take, you know, in the whatever we choose to do, and whatever governance system we live under and around and with. But I also think that agency happens in very kinds of informal ways, and that has a lot of power as well. So I think that our sense of who influences the future, and whether or not we feel like we have the capacity to act upon certain kinds of futures, is absolutely critical. And that's what I love about doing futures work is we often think about the future, but we often don't think about how we think about the future. So it's the chance to reflect on our thinking, to actually find ways of being more critical and creative, to obviously implement, you know, tools and processes and methods. But at the end of the day, that's just about people. And that's what I really love about doing this kind of work, is that, you know, really when we get rid of all of the technical stuff and the terms, we're talking about people and what's important to them. And so I think for myself, and I've been very fortunate to work with, you know, agencies and organizations at the front lines of these kinds of issues and questions, it is about finding better ways to empower people and to give people the means by which to realize those futures. I think as we mentioned, and I think Aditee pointed this out, we don't want people to feel like they're simply inheriting or forced upon what Sohail and Ayatollah calls used futures. We have to find ways of critically, again, creating and imagining possibilities for that might lie ahead. That could be entirely novel, that could be fully experimental, but that really achieve and realize the values and the vision that we want to have collectively. And I think now more than ever, there's a lot of humility in this kind of work, realizing the kind of work that we have to do. But if we don't take it on, I think, unfortunately, the future will continue to be colonized. So I think it's a real call to arms for futurists to be able to work in this way and to hold this kind of a space, yeah? The last thing we can do is collapse the future. As long as there are futures, I think that's a very political thing to say, that as long as the future is always plural, the future is always a space of possibility. It's a space of agency, it's a space of hope. and we then have to act to shape it. So I think for me, that's a critical part of this whole conversation.
We're always dealing with man, time, and space.
Yeah, so the follow-up point around sort of, fulfilling to feel you have agency, you're making an impact, how to connect this to the sort of imagined, the perceptual, the quantifying part's hard. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's days where like clearly I struggle, right, with this, but I think that actually it's the possibility and the opportunity for my own sort of learning. And again, if I bring it back to myself, like, how am I learning to contribute and how am I sharing learning to contribute towards precisely this? In times sometimes of crisis, the most dynamic forms of resistance are those that keep ideas alive. And so I think actually not falling back into this, let's go back to normal, or now this is, oh, wow, thankfully we made it through that crisis, we got lucky, let's just sort of get on with life. I think if we don't take up precisely this question around agency, around empowerment, around impact, around linking the kind of perceptual to the actual, then I think we'll unfortunately maybe be having this conversation 10 years from now in the next crisis, or the worst crisis, or facing an even more unimaginable set of crises. So and that I think is the biggest lesson for us, right? Is this a dress rehearsal for climate change? In some ways, yes and no. Like this is linked directly to these kinds of crises. So I think now it's about putting into practice things that we've been discussing for decades, if not for generations. So what do you want to learn, Aditee?
I want to know about the roots and then simultaneously follow it to know where we are going. I want to actually be a significant part of the future that we'd be living in. And unless and until I know the roots, know my past, I don't think, for me personally, it would be in Almaty when I came, I realized over here Women's Day is a big thing, which back in India is not. And just hearing about it from different people, I thought of getting out on the street and seeing what it was. And randomly, like, I got flowers from around 3 to 4 people just congratulating me for being a woman. And that was actually surprising for me. But then I realized how there are places where you give importance to something and how it's a part of your life, how it influences of you being who you are. Simultaneously, there are parts which influences the other aspects of it. Might direct us to be who we want to be. What about you, John? What do you want to learn?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess like I'm always learning how to learn. So I think that, part of what I try to do in my own practice is to find more different ways to challenge myself in my own learning. So, and actually that sometimes means I have to focus on unlearning. So, now that I'm back in a research role and trying to, teach futures, I'm trying to also think about in different ways to connect with people and to maybe blur the boundaries between the facilitating and teaching, and even blur the boundaries between student and professor, and realize it's a journey that we're all on together. So I think, my own learning is also around trying to find better ways of communicating and talking to people, and helping myself and others unlearn the kinds of things and traps that we all fall into in our thought.
We have a comment. The religious guys will say it is a necessary part to learn.
Yeah, so there's no doubt, at least from my view, that we have to find, better or different or more creative or maybe even more spiritual means to connect with people in those deep roots. I mean, certainly one of the challenges we have now is that maybe people don't want to have conversations, right? They believe in a certain truth with a capital T. And so, we have to find ways of engaging. So I think that's it's not nothing new about that challenge in many ways, although maybe we're feeling, you know, the kind of brunt of it now. So I think actually that this is what's really quite critical, is to try to continue to have those spaces of conversation and engagement, especially when they might seem difficult. Yeah.